Hello, everybody. It is so wonderful to see you all. My name is Wendy Singer, and I am Director of Education at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. I am honored to welcome you to this special online presentation of our annual Pfeffer Family Forum, Lessons from Elie Wiesel for Today with Rabbi Ariel Burger. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our board of directors, staff, and volunteers, I would like to recognize the incredible generosity of the Pfeffer family who are all with us today virtually. Thank you for your steadfast commitment to honoring the memory of the Holocaust and your support in creating an ongoing program that educates the public and serves as a catalyst for continued reflection about the history of the Holocaust and its legacy for today. A thank you to our community partners for supporting today's program that were listed on the slides prior to the program start. This program is being recorded and will be available via our YouTube channel in the coming days. Following today's program, we do have time for a short audience question and answer session. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. There are hundreds of viewers with us from across the nation and even some from around the globe. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible, but may not be able to answer all of them. Also, I'm launching a poll. We would love to see how many are watching with you today for our program. It is now my true honor to introduce Jeff Pfeffer, an outstanding friend, supporter, and chair of our board of directors. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Wendy. Good afternoon. On behalf of our family, I'm honored to welcome you to this year's edition of the Pfeffer Family Forum. For the last 10 years, we've invited speakers from all over the world to our museum so they can share their specific focus and stories of the Holocaust. Since late March, the museum pivoted to virtual field trips, tours, seminars, book readings, and more. I want to recognize Kelly Zaney, Wendy Singer, and our education staff for their high level of excellence achieved during COVID. The museum's community reach, now measured by in-person as well as virtual visitors, is up almost 50% versus last year. The pandemic has caused us all to reevaluate our lives, and the museum's expanded community reach is a byproduct of this crisis. I am pleased to share that today's attendance of approximately 500 is a forum record. And now, without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Dr. Ariel Burger. Rabbi Burger is the founding director and senior scholar of the Witness Institute, whose mission is to empower emerging leaders inspired by the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel. Ariel is an author, teacher, and artist whose work integrates spirituality, the arts, and strategies for social change. An Orthodox trained rabbi, Ariel received his PhD in Jewish studies and conflict resolution. A lifelong student of Professor Wiesel, Ariel served as his teaching fellow from 2003 to 2008, after which he directed education initiatives at Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston. As a Covenant Foundation grantee, Ariel develops cutting-edge arts and educational programming for adults, facilitates workshops for educators, consults to nonprofits, and serves as a scholar, artist in residence for institutions around the US. In 2019, Ariel was chosen as one of Allgemeyer's top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life today. In 2018, Rabbi Burger won the National Jewish Book Award for Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. Ariel first met Elie Wiesel at age 15. They studied and taught together. Witness chronicles the intimate conversations between these two men over decades as Ariel sought counsel on matters of intellect, spirituality, and faith while navigating his own personal journey from boyhood to manhood, from student and assistant to rabbi, and in time, teacher. In an article entitled Learning and Teaching from the Heart in Troubled Times, Arielle writes, I learned about the balance of ferocity, humility, and tenderness from Elie Wiesel. He believed that education, when designed with a focus on morality and humanism, could change the course of human history. He goes on to write, as a teacher, Professor Wiesel believed in the power of literature, of the study of history, and the history of ideas to make a difference in the lives of students and in the destiny of humankind. My goal as a teacher, he often said, is to humanize, to sensitize. He told his students, whatever you learn, remember, the learning must make you more, not less human. My family and I look forward to what we know will be a profoundly thought-provoking and inspiring afternoon as we are taken into Elie Wiesel's classroom, where the art of listening and storytelling conspire to keep memory alive. And now, we welcome Rabbi Ariel Burger.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks to all of you, the Pfeffer family, the staff and board of the museum. I have followed the work of the museum for a long time, and it's an honor to be with all of you. We are living in very interesting times, and we are dealing with questions that are new and questions that we thought were old and long resolved. Questions about the rise of anti-Semitism and hatred, racism and racial injustice, polarization, our inability to disagree well and in healthy ways, taking care of ourselves and people on the other side of the world. What is our moral responsibility to people who are suffering in our neighborhoods or in other countries? These and many questions preoccupy me. I'm sure they preoccupy a lot of you. And if they preoccupy me, it's because of my teacher, Elie Wiesel. And if in spite of all the challenges that we're facing, I feel a sense of hopefulness, a kind of internal insistence on optimism, it's in large measure because of my teacher, Elie Wiesel. As Jeff mentioned, I met Professor Wiesel when I was 15 years old in New York City at a lecture he gave at the 92nd Street Y. The lecture was on King Solomon. I don't remember much about the lecture because I was very nervous. I knew I was going to be meeting Professor Wiesel after the lecture. But I remember it was about King Solomon, and I remember the anticipation I felt getting ready to meet this great man whose works I had read. I'd read Night and Souls on Fire and many of his other books. And Professor Wiesel, of course, was a well-known Jewish leader, perhaps the best-known Jewish leader in my time growing up. And I remember after the lecture, we were allowed into a small reception room where we could meet Professor Wiesel. There was a long line. We waited online and had a moment to say hello to him. And when it was my turn at the front of the line, I remember that Professor Wiesel held his hand out to me and he said his name as if I had no idea who he was, with tremendous modesty. And then he said something that would change the course of my life, though I didn't know it at the time. He said, "Come visit me and bring a question." Now, it took me about 7 or 8 months to build up the holy chutzpah, as some people call it, to actually go see Professor Wiesel and bring a question. But I had a lot of questions as a young person, and the questions were pressing, they were urgent. Questions about the relationship between Jewish tradition and the wild creativity of the young artist I was. Questions about inclusion of people with disabilities, people who are different. I have an older sister who's blind, and that sensitized me to these questions when I was young. And many other questions, and they were pressing, they were so urgent that I really had no choice but to go to someone I thought could answer these questions. And I saw Professor Wiesel, correctly as it turns out, as someone who bridged the worlds in which I was traveling. I was in a very religious Orthodox day school, and I saw Professor Wiesel as someone deeply rooted in pre-war Jewish life, the life of study, learning, prayer, practice, the tales of our tradition. But I was also living, of course, in the modern world. And I cared a lot about world events, current events, questions of human rights, and things like that. And Professor Wiesel was, of course, so deeply involved in the world. And so I went to him finally, and I asked him many questions. And I met with him several times. And after a few meetings, I noticed something strange. I noticed that he never answered any of my questions. And at first, this troubled me, but then I realized two things. Number one, I realized this is a classic Jewish response. You answer a question with another question. It comes from the Talmud, actually. But I also realized that Professor Wiesel's questions and his stories were very helpful, even though they were not answers. They helped me to refine my thinking, to refine my questions. They helped me to go on. They helped me to find a new way of living into the questions. As a person, as a Jew, as a member of a community, actually a member of several communities. And every time I left his home where we met, I felt more deeply empowered and inspired and ready to continue my own journey. There was one question I didn't ask him because it felt too personal. It was a question I wanted to ask him after reading Night. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, have read Night by Elie Wiesel. And you may remember the very last moment in that book, his first book, his memoir of the Holocaust, of the camps. The last moment, the last image in Night is young Eliezer Wiesel, just liberated from Buchenwald, looking in a mirror, and he writes, "A corpse was looking back." A very dark image, and understandably so. And yet, the man I was getting to know was a person of great humor, great joy, a love of chocolate and chocolate rugelach, and someone with a childlike curiosity and enjoyment of life. And I wanted to ask him, Professor, how did you become this person who's so filled with life and hope and humor, optimism, joy, love of learning, love of people, love of students, always reading, always curious, embracing life? How did you come to embrace life? I didn't ask him the question, as I said, but a few years later, when I was in his classroom at Boston University, where he taught for almost 40 years, a student asked my question on the last day of class. And she asked him, Professor, how did you keep going after the Holocaust? And how did you find hope and joy? And he said, if you ask me how I survived, I can't not answer. I have no idea. I was not stronger than others. I wasn't well connected in the camps. And there were moments when I had less will to live than many others. But if you ask me about after the war, after liberation, that I can tell you. He said, it was learning that saved me. It was my love of learning. And then he told us this story. He said, on the day after liberation, which really is the page after the last page of Night, how the story continues after Night. Professor Wiesel told us the children who were orphans of Buchenwald were gathered together by the American military, the liberators, and members of the international aid groups who were providing aid and medical care and attention to the children before the children were going to be shipped off to orphanages in France and Switzerland. They gathered us, he said, and they asked us, is there anything we can give you today to make your lives a little bit better on this day after liberation? And Professor Wiesel told us, I remember a young girl asked for chocolate because she hadn't eaten chocolate in so long. And a young boy asked for a coat or a sweater because he had not been warm for 3 years. But I asked, said Professor Wiesel, for the same volume of the Talmud that I was studying before the war. The same tractate of the Talmud, the great compilation of Jewish law and legend that I was studying before the war, so that I could continue my studies at the exact same line, in the exact same word where my studies were interrupted. And that is what saved me. The return to learning saved my sanity and my hope. And then he added, I believe that learning can save us all. Now, for any of us who are invested deeply in education, this will resonate. And if we know anything about Professor Wiesel's life and work, we know that he cared very deeply about and believed deeply in education. He honored teachers. He cared about the educational element in any solution to any problem that humanity faces, because he told us that the educational element is the most important element. You can develop great policy solutions to current events and challenges, global or local challenges. But if you ignore the educational component, you're not creating a sustainable response or solution. He cared about education, and he pointed out, for example, that if you look at Jewish history, you'll find that those communities that had a real commitment to lifelong learning, academies of learning, not just for children, but for all ages, those Jewish communities lasted for thousands of years. And those communities that had all the infrastructure of a community but did not have that commitment to lifelong learning, those communities disappeared after 500 or 600 years. And he pointed out that according to Jewish tradition, if a teacher is exiled and has to leave his or her place, the student goes with the teacher into exile. And the opposite is also true. If a student has to leave, the teacher must accompany the student, because we never separate the teacher-student bond. It's so powerful and so important. It's the unit of transmission of our legacy, of the continuity, the eternity of the Jewish people. He cared deeply about education. But when he said this, I believe that learning can save us all. It raised a question for me. And the question it raised for me was based on something else that Professor Wiesel taught us, a difficult truth about the Holocaust, one of many, many difficult truths about the Holocaust, which is that we know that many of the worst perpetrators of the final solution were highly educated people. Many of the SS had PhDs. There were doctors and lawyers involved at every level of the Nazi regime, from frontline killers to people in back offices keeping records of how many Jews were killed in each town and village and city and ghetto. And so these agents of evil were highly educated, highly cultured. Germany was known as the cultural capital of the West. These were students of Kant and Goethe, lovers of Beethoven and Bach, and it did not inoculate them against hatred. And so I asked Professor Wiesel after class, Professor, what about that? What about those who were so highly educated and it didn't help? It didn't help them to become moral upstanders, moral agents. He said, well, it depends on the kind of education we're talking about. And there's one key ingredient that we must consider when we talk about education. But before I tell you what that key ingredient is, I want to back up and tell you more about Professor Wiesel's classroom. So after a couple of years of visiting him and asking him my personal questions, and he was very generous with his time, I enrolled at Boston University to study with him. And I enrolled in his class, and I was a sophomore in college, and I had one goal for the entire semester. My goal was to go unnoticed, to sit in the corner and not be called on by Professor Wiesel. You have to understand, Professor Wiesel's classroom was filled with 65 or 70 students from around the world. It was an international group of many ages, many backgrounds, and he had students who were pursuing degrees in religious studies, in theology and philosophy, history, also in theater, many other fields. But because he was Elie Wiesel, he also attracted students who were on various difficult, complex personal journeys. So it won't surprise you to hear that many children of survivors and then grandchildren of survivors came to Elie Wiesel's classroom. For many of them, he was a kind of proxy for their parents who would not speak of their experiences of the Holocaust. And you know, there are survivors who speak of their experiences. There are survivors who find it very difficult to speak of their experiences. And second generation children of survivors often struggle because they know there's a universe of experience that they know nothing about or very little about. Some of those people came to Professor Wiesel. Later, the grandchildren came. So that's not surprising that he always attracted those kinds of students. What surprised me more was that occasionally he also attracted students who were grandchildren of Nazi officers, who were trying to come to terms with the dark legacy of their family. And one such student met him at a conference in Germany, approached him after a plenary session, and told him, Professor, my grandfather was in the SS, and I don't know what to do. I don't know if I have to change my name. I don't know how to live with my family legacy. What's my responsibility to that legacy? Professor Wiesel told her, in my tradition, the Jewish tradition, we do not believe in collective guilt. So you have a burden of history that you have to redeem, but you can do something wonderful with it. And it's not your fault. And then he said to her, come and study with me in Boston. And she did for many years. And so he attracted students like that as well, and students who had survived violence in countries in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. So this was not an ordinary classroom. And you have to also understand that Professor Wiesel's class was called Literature of Memory, always called Literature of Memory. We'll see why in a little bit, but each course had its own course title, but that was the headline for almost 40 years. And each week, students read an entire novel or play and studied it with Professor Wiesel. Why? Because I found out in the course of writing my book, Witness, that Professor Wiesel taught a course on the Holocaust. And if I asked you, how many times do you think Elie Wiesel taught a course about the Holocaust in his career? I'd be curious to hear your guesses. But the answer is he taught a course about the Holocaust exactly one time in his career as a university professor. The first year that he taught a course entirely devoted to the Holocaust. Diaries of those who didn't survive and hid or buried their diaries, diaries of some who did survive. And he never did it again. And I asked him why. He said, it's not my job to bring my students to despair. I had to find another way of approaching these stories. And the way that he found to approach the imposing, difficult stories and realities of the Holocaust was through literature, through the enduring questions raised by great novelists and playwrights and philosophers. The Holocaust was always present in the room, but it wasn't the subject explicitly of the entire course. It was too much. It was almost as if students would be blinded by the dark light of the Holocaust if they were going to spend an entire semester diving into that material. And so he found ways of doing it that were digestible and still transformative, and that allowed students to sustain the encounter with the Holocaust through literature. So this is the scene, and you have to also understand one other thing, that Professor Wiesel loved and respected his students very deeply. At the beginning of every semester, he would say, there's only one person in this room you're allowed to interrupt during the course of this semester, and that's me. You're not allowed to interrupt one another. And he also said, I will learn as much from you as you will learn from me. Now, students didn't always believe that, but he meant it. He really meant it. He saw himself as the best student in the class, not as the teacher, equally on a journey with great curiosity. So when I asked him my question, it was right outside that room, right after a lecture where this question was asked and he had responded the way he responded about learning and learning saving us. And I asked him my question about moral education and those who were highly educated and still committed atrocities, or through their indifference allowed atrocities to take place. He told me there's a secret ingredient in education which makes all the difference between someone who is educated and goes on to kill or to allow suffering or murder or oppression to take place, and the kind of education that inoculates against hatred and indifference. And that difference between those two kinds of education can be summed up in one word. And for Elie Wiesel, it's a sacred word, it's a holy word. The word is memory. And it has a capital M. When you heard him say this word, you would hear the capital M. Memory means the transmission of information about the past, yes, and that's critically important. And we're living in a time when memory, historical memory, is perhaps more important than it's been any time in the last 70 years. And it's an endangered species. We know this, and you've seen the Claims Conference study and other studies by the Anti-Defamation League and others, and other educational institutions that show that something like 66% of millennials in this country couldn't identify the word Auschwitz, 23% couldn't explain what the Holocaust was. There have been many studies and also anecdotal moments, videos on YouTube. You can find interviews with Ivy League students who don't know anything about the Holocaust. And so memory, that level of memory is endangered, it's important. And the work of educational institutions like the museum and education center is more and more critical. But by memory, Professor Wiesel meant not just the transmission of facts and information, he also meant something else. He meant the deep encounter with stories that change you. The encounter with stories that you carry for the rest of your life. When you read the story of a survivor, or the diary of someone who did not survive, or you read a story of someone who faced a very difficult moral choice and made the right choice. You carry those stories, it changes your mind, it changes your heart and even your nervous system. And the next time you're walking down the street and you see a hungry person, you cannot turn away. You cannot ignore a human being anymore. You're less likely to be indifferent to the suffering of others. You feel more implicated in others' suffering and others' lives in general. And Professor Wiesel told us, my goal as an educator is to humanize, to sensitize, to help my students move from being spectators to being witnesses. A witness in Elie Wiesel's language doesn't just mean someone who sees something happen. It's someone who feels implicated in what's happening and has to act and has really no choice but to act. There's always a choice, but the wiring is there that pushes, that galvanizes, that catalyzes action in response to suffering because a witness has been sensitized through memory. And so memory for Professor Wiesel was so critically important and drove everything he did as a teacher, as a writer, as a witness, and as an activist, as a human rights activist and confidant of presidents and prime ministers. For us in the classroom, the way this worked was fascinating and multifaceted. Sometimes it happened through intensity, sometimes it happened through humor, sometimes through silence, sometimes through song. But always there were questions. There were questions that Professor Wiesel shared with us or elicited from us. Questions about the novel we were reading or the play we were studying, but also questions about world events, questions about history, the history of the 20th century, but also ancient history. Whether we were reading the Book of Job or Shakespeare or Jane Austen or Kafka, the questions were always there, the big enduring questions about human behavior. Why do human beings allow hatred to grow in their hearts? Why do human beings remain indifferent when people are suffering? How can it be that after Auschwitz there have been other genocides? How can it possibly be that the world hasn't learned the lessons? How is it possible to relate to God or any idea of God after the Holocaust and God's silence? What is the relationship between madness and protest and rebellion in the face of gratuitous suffering and oppression? These are the kinds of questions that Professor Wiesel constantly came back to. There were three meta questions that were always present and that he came back to very often. The first was, how do we really adjust, change, evolve human behavior? How do we get into the mechanics of moral transformation so that our destiny can be different, so that our future history can be different, so there will be no more genocides? And not just that, but that we can have a culture all around the world of true respect and reverence for otherness, for others, for difference, for diversity, not just as a cliche or a platitude, but really embodied and practiced. How can we change human behavior? The second question was about the role of God. And of course, this was a big preoccupation for Elie Wiesel his whole life. And we talked about it very often. And of course, he wrote about it, first in Night and then in many other works. How do we relate to God's silence? And the third question, which perhaps for him was the most important, was when Professor Wiesel would turn to us in the classroom and say, where are you in all of this? What are you going to do to make the world a little bit better, a little bit more human, a little bit more compassionate? And so I want to tease out some of the themes that he elaborated and unpacked in class, but I want to return to that moment when I was sitting in his classroom hoping not to be noticed. This is back to when I was a sophomore in college. And I want to tell you that I almost succeeded. I almost went through the whole semester without being called upon by Professor Wiesel. But there was one day when we were reading a book, a novel called Loving Kindness by Anne Royfie, wonderful novel. And Professor Wiesel asked a question about one of the characters' choices in the novel. And then he looked at me and he waited what seemed a very, very long time. And there was a long, uncomfortable silence, and I had no choice but to respond. And so I said the word that was in my mind. The word was authenticity. And Professor Wiesel nodded and smiled and said, exactly. And a couple of weeks later, he asked me if I would become his teaching assistant the following year. So I always tell audiences that the word authenticity is a magic word. If you're ever trying to get a job or persuade someone to marry you or raise money, just bring the word authenticity into the conversation somehow. It works to open doors. And I'm joking, but I also felt that way. I felt, wow, what a strange thing. Of course, I knew Professor Wiesel at that point, but still, it felt like a door had opened magically. And I declined his invitation. And I declined his invitation regretfully and with great difficulty because I was already planning on studying abroad in Israel the following year. I felt I needed to deepen my own relationship to my Jewish knowledge and Jewish tradition and practice. And I wanted to dive into the texts of our tradition in a way that I hadn't done yet. And so I wrote him a letter explaining my decision. And it really was an agonizing decision. I wrote him a letter explaining my thought process. And then I called him at home. He picked up the phone. I said, Professor, did you get my letter? He said, I did. And I said, and? He said, well, you know, I celebrate learning. I believe very deeply in learning. And so I'm really happy that you're going to study. It's very good. And then he said, I will wait for you. When you're finished, come back and you'll be my teaching assistant then. And at the time, I thought he was just being kind to a young student who had faced a difficult decision, but he really meant it. And 7 years later, after I had finished a round of study, you never really finished, but I'd finished a round of study, I'd become a rabbi, I met with Professor Wiesel, really to ask his advice about my next steps. And he said, why are you considering any other career paths right now? I told you I'd wait for you. Come and study with me now. Come back to Boston University and study with me. And so I did. And for the next 5 years, I sat in his classroom watching as he transformed the lives and the moral trajectories of students from around the world. And I started asking questions about how is he doing this? How does it work? What's the methodology? How does Professor Elie Wiesel speak to students from so many diverse backgrounds, of so many ages, so many disciplines, academic disciplines, and find a way to activate them to become moral agents? And because I was the teaching assistant, I met with students and I heard from students what was happening. I heard what was happening in lecture. They told me afterwards, that was the moment that I realized I have to give more. I have to shift careers. I have to not just think about making money. I have to find a way to give, and I can give. I learned it from Professor Wiesel. That was the moment. And I hear this from students to this day, often. And I wondered, how is he doing it? And so I started paying attention to the methods, but also the themes that he emphasized. And I want to just underscore and highlight a few of those themes. And some of them will be familiar to you if you've read Elie Wiesel's works. In the classroom, it was a different voice. It was more intimate, filled with moments of humor and inquiry, but the themes are the same in his writing and in his teaching. I want to highlight 3 themes. The first one is language and the challenges of language. And this is a theme that's very relevant to anyone involved in Holocaust education today. How do we tell the story? For Professor Wiesel, after liberation, this was a very significant challenge. He felt a paradoxical obligation. On the one hand, he felt the obligation to tell the story, to bear witness. He felt it immediately after the war. We have to tell the story of what happened because no one's going to believe it. We have to tell the story. On the other hand, he felt the impossibility of telling the story. How can anyone find words to describe what happened? How can anyone possibly convey the experience? Much later, he told us he was sitting with a close friend of his, Rabbi Menashe Klein, with whom he had gone through the camps. They were both from Siget, the same hometown. They had gone through the camps together and they were reminiscing and they were telling stories, including stories about the camps, about Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And after one such story, Professor Wiesel turned to Rabbi Menashe Klein, his friend, and said, "Menashe, did that really happen?" And Rabbi Klein said, "I was there, and I can't believe it really happened." Even someone who was there saw things that couldn't be believed. How is anyone going to tell the story? And so some of you may know that Elie Wiesel took an oath not to speak of his experience of the Holocaust for 10 years. And he kept that oath. And for the 10 years after the Holocaust, when he was in the orphanage, then he studied at the Sorbonne, and he traveled, he became a journalist, he didn't speak of his Holocaust experience, and he didn't write about his Holocaust experience. It was there like a shadow, but he didn't speak of it. After 10 years and an encounter with a great French Catholic intellectual, which you can read about in the preface tonight, he started writing, and he wrote a book. And the book was, I think, 867 pages long, and it was a memoir recounting his experience of the Holocaust. And it was written in Yiddish, and it had a Yiddish title which translates to "And the World Remains Silent." And then he took that manuscript and he reduced it and reduced it and reduced it to the book that we have now, the book Night, which you can see behind me on my bookshelf. It's, I think, 112 or 113 pages long, translated by his wife, Marion Wiesel, a distillation of that longer book, an act of subtraction. I asked Professor Wiesel, why did you write it that way? Why did you first write a longer book and then cut it down to a shorter book that we have? He said, I had to write it that way. He said, Ariel, you're a painter, so you know that when you paint, you add material to the canvas. But writing for me is not like painting, it's like sculpture. The sculptor sees an image hiding inside a block of marble and reveals that image by reducing and removing the excess marble. That's how I write. And he said to me, the words that I removed are still there. You can't see them, but they're still there. They exert a kind of pull, a kind of gravitational pull. This is an example of how sensitive Professor Wiesel was to language and the challenge of telling the story of the Holocaust. And it came along with other kinds of sensitivity to language where he said, you have to understand that there are words that after the Holocaust have different meaning. There are words like selection, fire, chimney. When you hear those words after the Holocaust, you have to tremble. It doesn't mean you can't use those words, but you have to know that they meant something different in what he called the kingdom of night. And he taught us, his students, to be very, very sensitive to language, to use language carefully, knowing that language can destroy and it can build worlds. It can heal and it can destroy all hope. Second, Professor Wiesel was preoccupied with faith. And I mentioned this earlier. How do we move on with any sort of conception of a benign God, a compassionate God after the Holocaust? Elie Wiesel was a very religious child. He had a kind of love affair with God as a child that he described in his writings and in his classroom. He talked about how when other kids were playing outside, he would be inside the synagogue reciting psalms and yearning for the coming of the Messiah to redeem the world. He told us that he knew the name Jerusalem before he knew the name of his own hometown. He was so connected to Jewish tradition and Jewish learning. As a 13-year-old, he started studying Jewish mysticism, which you're not really supposed to do. You're supposed to wait until you're 40 years old. But he started with two friends. And he told us the story that after a few weeks of this, one of his friends went mad. And a few weeks went on, and the other friend also went mad. And a few weeks later, Professor Wiesel told us the Nazis invaded Siget. They invaded his town. He said, it's strange to say, but I really believe that if the Nazis had not invaded, I would have joined my friends in madness. He was deeply religious, filled with yearning, and then, of course, he encountered the kingdom of night. His faith was shattered. He describes it in Night. You remember those descriptions. His faith was shattered, and he came out after the Holocaust and spent the next years recreating a kind of faith that he called a wounded faith. And it's a faith of questioning. It's a faith of arguing with God. It's a faith that embraces questions and challenges and says there's no contradiction between faith and questions, because faith really is an expression of relationship. And if the relationship is a relationship filled with quarrel and difficulty, it's still a relationship. And so Professor Wiesel said, you can be for God and even against God, but you cannot be without God. And he also pointed out on a more historical level that any social movement that removed God from their ideology quickly replaced God with something else, which they then worshiped as a God, whether it was the Führer or history. And you see this in fascism and in communism both. We have a human need to relate somehow to the absolute. And when a student asked him, Professor, why didn't you just give up on God? His answer was, that would have been too easy. This way it's harder, and I embrace the difficulty. And the third preoccupation, of course, is fighting hatred and protesting. As someone who experienced the worst of human violence and indifference, Professor Wiesel could have given up on the world and could have devoted his attention only to Jewish causes. But instead he said, because we suffered, no one else should ever have to suffer. And because when we suffered, we heard the world's silence, when others suffer, they need to hear us protesting. Even if we cannot make a practical difference, and sometimes you don't know if you can, and you need to try, but even if you can't, even if your efforts amount to nothing, the act of protest itself is a response to at least let the victims know that they're not alone. And that is a core fundamental human responsibility, the protest against indifference, filling the silence, giving voice to the voiceless. And I think about those who are suffering today around the world and how we have to learn to be their voices, and how easy it is for us in a certain way because we have a global language and global access to information, and that increases our responsibility to be that voice. Lest you think that these lessons were imparted only in a spirit of sobriety and seriousness and severity, you have to understand that we laughed a lot in class. And Professor Wiesel would tell us jokes and funny stories along the way. And there was a great emotional range. We would move from intensity to humor and back again. And very often there were moments when it felt like the conversation is too much. Students' hearts are about to explode, and he would calm it down. He would tell us, I met the author. And he would tell us the story of when he met Sam Beckett. He would tell us a funny story about visiting Samuel Beckett at a cafe and arriving, and Samuel Beckett, the great author of Waiting for Godot and other works, wasn't there. And Professor Wiesel waited and waited and waited at the cafe, and Beckett wasn't showing up. And then he saw on the other side of the cafe a man, tall, with a kind of hawk nose and piercing blue eyes, looking at his watch, and he realized that's Beckett. He's been here the whole time. And so he went over to Samuel Beckett. They both realized what had happened, and then they sat together for another hour in complete silence, and then shook hands and parted. He would tell us those stories because they were fascinating, but also as a way of smoothing over the difficult encounters that were necessary for moral education of students. And he would tell us jokes, often about his own experiences with mistaken identity. He told us a story once, for example, about walking in New York City, and a young couple passed him on the street, and he heard the young woman say to the young man, "I think that's Elie Wiesel." And then she came back and looked at his face and went back to the young man and said, "No, it's not." He told that story and laughed and laughed and laughed. And somehow was able to hold a space for students to really reflect on their own biases and assumptions about the world and about themselves. And I want to end with a story and a moment that really changed my life and the lives of students who were there, that captures a lot of his approach to moral education, to life in general. And it was a moment during the last day of class, the last class meeting. The class was over the course of a semester, and we always read a book a week and discussed the book and all of the issues and themes that were raised and the enduring questions they connected us to. But the last day of class was different. The last day of class was an open forum where students could ask any question they wanted. And Professor Wiesel would say, the floor is open, I'm yours, ask me anything. And so on this occasion, it was in 2007, I think, 2007, there were questions about the Iranian nuclear program, other current events, political questions of the day. And then a student sitting in the front row raised his hand and asked, Professor, can we see the number on your arm? Can we see your tattoo? And there was a long silence, a kind of gasp from some students. The student who asked the question turned red and hunkered down in his seat. He couldn't believe he had the chutzpah to ask such a question. And Professor Wiesel, without a word, removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeve, and showed the class the number tattooed on his arm that he had received at Auschwitz. Rolled his sleeve back down, buttoned it, put his jacket back on, and said, next question. And there was a long silence before we continued the conversation, and I wondered, why did Professor Wiesel share the number on his arm? And what was this moment of education, of transmission? What does it mean, this kind of transmission without words? And I think the answer is something that Professor Wiesel taught us and said very often. He taught us that listening to a witness makes you a witness. Remember earlier we spoke about memory and how memory is the essential ingredient in education that makes education truly a force for good and blessing, that can sensitize people to no longer be indifferent or to no longer be sources of hatred and violence and destruction. Memory is the critical ingredient, and memory is transmittable. And when you encounter the story of a witness or the number on a witness's arm, you become a witness to the witness. And you now carry the burden and the blessing of responsibility to share what you saw with others, to pass it forward to new generations and people who don't know the stories. And I found out a little while after this moment that there was, just a few months earlier, there was a Holocaust denier who had written letters to the Boston University faculty and administration claiming that Elie Wiesel didn't have a number on his arm, that he wasn't in the Holocaust. And Elie Wiesel responded by deputizing 65 or 70 students to be able to say, I was there and I saw it with my own eyes. We are witnesses. We are the hope of Professor Wiesel to make the world better and to continue his work. And we have an enormous responsibility to draw on all of our creativity and passion in doing so, finding new ways of telling the story to new generations in ways that are digestible, effective, inspiring, motivating, so that we create more and more witnesses who can be forces for good in the world and forces against indifference in the world. That is our job. That is the legacy of Professor Wiesel. And we have to do it, let us not forget, with a sense of privilege and joy. Because as he told us, tragedy doesn't define us. It is our response to tragedy that defines us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Burger. While I'm asking you the questions, there's a little bit of feedback, so I'm going to ask you to put it on mute until you answer the question. Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, we have a lot of really excellent questions from our audience today, and some you have already answered throughout your talk, so we appreciate that. Thank you so much for the book Witness, says one of our visitors. I would love for Rabbi Burger to elaborate on this. Vulnerability is the greatest weapon if you're brave enough to use it. What are your comments on that quote?
So that quote, I think, is from my book, Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom, and it's based on a moment in class when we were studying the story of King David, the story of David and Goliath. And we were using Robert Alter's great translation of 1st and 2nd Samuel. That was the text we were studying, but we were specifically diving into the story of David's encounter with Goliath. And in the story, you may remember that Goliath is a giant. He's attacking the camps of Israel. Saul is the king. He's looking for someone to volunteer to fight this giant, this imposing, undefeated champion of the Philistines. And David, as a young boy, comes forward and volunteers. And the first thing that happens in the text is that King Saul gives young David the king's armor, because you need armor if you're going to fight a giant. And David takes off the armor and places it on the ground and goes off to fight the giant without any armor at all, except for his faith. So we were discussing this in class. This has become a very important image for me in my thinking and also in my art. I've drawn this image a lot and painted it. And I think it's a paradigm. When we encounter otherness, or when we are anxious or afraid, and we're dealing with something that is anxiety producing, whether it's a pandemic or a threatening political opinion, perhaps in our own family, those kinds of issues raise anxiety, and we often armor up. We protect ourselves, and the first move is to protect ourselves, and that can, not always, but it can reduce the possibility of a real dialogue. And so Professor Wiesel was talking about how sometimes counterintuitively, you have to remove your armor and be willing to be vulnerable and honest and transparent in order to create the possibility of dialogue. And he told us a story, and I'll end with this. At a conference that he organized, he invited Nelson Mandela and a member of the de Klerk government, which was, of course, the government responsible for apartheid in those times. And this was a conference where everything that was said was offline. It was completely private. It would not be shared with media or anything. And at the beginning of the conference, the government minister from the de Klerk government stood up and addressed Nelson Mandela across the room. He said, "I can say this here because this is a private space. Nelson, I grew up under apartheid. It is my fervent wish to attend its funeral." And for the rest of the 5-day conference, Mandela and the government minister were huddled in the corner talking. And that was the beginning of a dialogue that led with others to the end of apartheid. It was one human encounter and one moment of someone speaking off script in a way that could have gotten him in a lot of trouble with his own bosses, his own stakeholders. And so that was a moment of vulnerability that Professor Wiesel told us about, that we have to learn to cultivate as we're fighting the battles we need to fight today. Vulnerability can be a great weapon if it's honest.
Thank you. And what an appropriate moment to share with our audience that we have our next special exhibition is Mandela's Struggle for Freedom. And we'll be deep diving into some of the things that you talked about mid-February. I have to ask this question from Eva. Eva is 12 years old and she's with us today. Eva, thank you for being with us and being brave enough to ask a question. She's wondering how you got interested in being a rabbi. Was there a particular event or person who influenced you at an early age?
Eva, that's a great question. So there's really two answers. One is my grandfather, my mother's father, Sam Feinberg, always told me to become a rabbi and then take the document that says I'm a rabbi and put it in a drawer, meaning become a rabbi, but don't use it. So he always encouraged me to become a rabbi. Why did he say that? This leads to the second answer. I never really wanted to be a rabbi. What I wanted was to study Torah. I wanted to study the stories and the teachings of Jewish tradition, and I wanted to do it a lot and for a long time. And so signing up for a rabbinical program was a way of doing that. It was really kind of an excuse to spend years studying. And it was sort of like entering a college or a graduate program, which gave me an excuse and a structure to do all of that studying. Otherwise, I would have been pulled back to maybe to get a job or other things that of course are important, but I really wanted to devote the time to studying Torah. That was my real love. And I still love studying Torah, and I study Torah every day. And Professor Wiesel did too. He studied Talmud every day, and we talked a lot about the Torah that we were studying, whether it was the Torah portion of the week. Right now we're reading the story of Joseph and his brothers, or whether it was something else. We were always involved in that kind of study. That's really what drove me to be a rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Burger. Okay, put yourself on mute for the feedback, please. And I'm going to ask our next question. We only have time for one or two more. So I'm going to ask this one from David. The Elie Wiesel I knew, and who I loved was a storyteller. His ability to tell stories, to believe in the stories, and the ways he imparted them is in such a meaningful way, was unparalleled, and that is what drew me to him. He wrote about how he wrote and the conscious ways he wrote. Do you have any thoughts or insights that you could share with us on that?
Wonderful. Professor Wiesel often said, I'm a teacher and a storyteller, a writer and a storyteller, and storytelling was indeed at the center of his life. A big part of this was that he came from the Hasidic tradition. The Hasidic tradition was something that I didn't really know much about growing up, even though I grew up in an Orthodox environment. The Hasidic tradition was a kind of spiritual revolution that started 200 years ago in Eastern Europe, very close actually to where Elie Wiesel grew up. And it started with a storyteller, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel, the master of the good name. And there's a story about his storytelling and how he came to a town and was standing in the marketplace telling stories, and how the rabbi of the town was very upset because all the people in the town, all the Jews who usually came to synagogue, were in the marketplace listening to this storyteller instead of coming to synagogue. So the rabbi was really angry, and he went to the marketplace and he saw the storyteller, and he was about to start yelling at the storyteller, but before he could say anything, the storyteller, who of course was Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, looked at him and he said, I want to tell you a story. And he told a story, a very short story. He said, on the way here, I was driving the horses on my wagon, and none of the horses were making any noise. None of the horses were neighing. And I passed a peasant, a farmer on the way. And the farmer called up to me, he said, loosen the reins on the horses and they'll neigh. Loosen the reins and they'll neigh. That's the story. And the rabbi heard this story and he started crying. And he understood that the story was meant for him, that he was holding the reins too tight with his people, and that you have to give people room to express themselves. And he became a close follower of the Baal Shem Tov, one of the earliest followers of the Baal Shem Tov. And so Professor Wiesel would tell this kind of story to tell us about the power of storytelling. And one thing we know, in addition to that lineage of drawing upon Professor Wiesel's grandfather, who was a great storyteller, and the Hasidic tradition, which is all about storytelling and song, we also know that in a time of great polarization, we can disagree and argue about policies and opinions and positions, but it's very difficult to argue with a story. And stories can connect people at a time of polarization, at a time of disagreement. And if we can shift more to storytelling mode, we might succeed in connecting across difference. And that's something that Professor Wiesel taught us. I want to just say, if we don't get to your question, you can visit my website and contact me with your question and I will respond to you. It might take some time, but I will respond to you. So far, I've been able to respond to everyone who's written with a question. And it's www.arielburger, arielburger.com. And there's a contact tab where you can email me. It'll go to my own personal inbox. Thanks, Wendy. You can also learn more about the work that I'm doing now and continuing to build on Professor Wiesel's teachings through the Witness Institute.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Burger. I'm so grateful, and on behalf of all of us who are with you today for this hour of inspirational learning, and a thank you to the Pfeffer Family Forum program and the Pfeffer family for bringing this outstanding program to us. If you have a moment, your feedback is so important to us. We want to make sure that we're on the mark and we can continue to report back to our donors about our programming. There is a survey that we've placed in our chat. Our upcoming programs can be found on our events page, which I also listed in the chat. Our last program for 2020, and I'm actually, as many of you are, very pleased that this year is coming to an end, is a book and author program called Saving Free Speech from Itself, with noted journalist, essayist, law professor, and child of Holocaust survivors, Thane Rosenbaum. That will take place on Tuesday, December 15th at 12 p.m. Thank you, Rabbi Burger. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And if you have any questions, do reach out to us at the museum. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all. Stay very well.
Bye-bye.